Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jack Rasmus. He's the author of The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump. We're going to talk about the gas and issues in Ukraine and other important stuff. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with the Dr. Jack Rasmus. He's professor, author, and overall smart guy out of up in Northern California. Great book, as I said. And the name of his book, once again, is The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump. And I've got to say this, for those of you who don't know Dr. Jack, let me tell you, I've been knowing Dr. Jack for several years. And he has consistently predicted U.S. economic policy, what they would do, etc. And we're going to get some more of that. Trust me, listen to this guy. He understands this system very well. And I have yet to see him give me a prediction that wasn't spot on. All right, Dr. Jack, let's start here. A lot of things going on in Europe. Talk about your thoughts on the energy policy, what people look at as economic suicide that has happened here over the last few years between basically between the U.S. and Russia. To me, Europe is just economic cannon fodder. They're just a casualty. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is about, to me, the U.S. economic attack on Russia, and it just so happens that Europe has to bite the bullet. Oh well, being a friend of the U.S. is what is it? The old Henry Kissinger quote, right? Being a friend is dangerous or deadly or something. And being an enemy, yes, yeah, exactly. And Europe is getting the fatal part. Dr. Jack, let's talk.
Yeah, well, in January 2022, before the war in Ukraine erupted at late February of that year, I wrote a piece. And it's on my blog, jackrasmus.com, and you can find it on Counterpunch, LA Progressive, all the other blogs I write for. And what I said in that was 10 reasons why the U.S. May want Russia to invade. And one of those reasons, right at the top, either the second or third, I don't recall, it was to really consolidate their control of Europe economically. The objective of the U.S. was not only, first and foremost, to try to debilitate Russia, regime change, and wreck its economy that would bring regime change, which, of course, has not happened at all. In fact, quite the opposite. But part of that objective was to subjugate Europe economically, make it economically more dependent on the U.S., chase Russia out of the energy markets in Europe, which it did, but more than that, chase Russia out of Western Europe completely economically, which it also virtually has done. Although some of the Russian gas and oil is going through the back door into Russia. It's going to Turkey in the Middle East, and Turkey marks it up and resells it to Europe. So there's some of that going, although they're trying to close those loops as well. We're having a lot of difficulty. But it certainly has made Europe an economic dependency of the U.S., especially the engine of Europe, Germany. That's really now under the thumb of the U.S., not simply because of the sanctions and energy policy. Germany is increasingly dependent on U.S. oil and natural gas. The U.S. even forced Germany to build natural gas port terminals to accept U.S. natural gas, and now the natural gas is flowing into Germany. And that's really, a digression a bit. That's really what Trump's drill, baby, drill is about. The U.S. Is now committed to supplying Europe with the energy that it needs, especially Germany, which was very industrialized country. and needs a lot of energy. And to some extent also the Middle East. But the Middle East is, less secure long term because of the drift into the camp of the BRICS. So the U.S. is going to have to keep the lights on in Europe. And that makes Europe increasingly dependent on the U.S. In France, France is being chased out of Africa, one country after the other right now. So, its future doesn't look that secure. Although most of French energy comes from nuclear, not from gas. But the point I made, among 9 others, was, to consolidate control over the European economy, which has happened, especially Germany, and not just because of sanctions. The U.S. has implemented other policies as well to make Germany dependent, like Biden and his so-called misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. In other words, throwing big bucks at energy companies, alternative and fossil fuel.
If you could, so people will know, can you explain your understanding of the Inflation Reduction Act and how it works, and why it, particularly some of the Europeans have complained that it incentivizes European countries to leave there and move here?
Right. Well, it provides big incentives if you invest in the U.S. So Europe, which has been a basket case economically for some time, European companies, corporations don't see much of a future gain for profitability in Europe, but they see this big subsidy in the U.S. So they are relocating, reinvesting in the U.S. instead of in Europe because of the handouts. The Inflation Reduction Act is a big misnomer, as most of these acts are called now. It's part of Biden's 2022 shifting of $1.7 trillion from COVID relief to subsidizing businesses, corporate investment in the U.S. The other 2 acts were the Chip and Modernization Act, which gave $56 billion handouts, grants to semiconductor companies, not just U.S., but foreign as well, and mostly to bail out Intel, which is a basket case now. Intel, I think, got $18 billion from the government, and it's still in trouble.
Wow.
Yeah. And other companies like Samsung and TSMC and others, they got a nice big $5-6 billion freebie as well. It was a big slush fund for corporations, particularly chip companies, to come back to the U.S. because part of the U.S.'s long-term strategy, focusing on China, is to get these strategic U.S. companies out of Asia and back to the U.S. Because, if they go to war with China, well, those are dead, right? Those companies are dead. So that's part of what the Chip and Modernization Act is about. That was the second bill. The infrastructure bill was the third bill. And then, of course, you have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really subsidies and tax cuts and so forth to energy companies, partly alternative energy, so the U.S. would not be as dependent on oil because it's shipping a lot of it to Europe now. And the 3 of them together amounted to $1.7 trillion. That's what Biden did. He cut the COVID relief bill and the measures to support households here because of the shutdown that they engineered of the economy. He just cut that out early. The housing assistance, the unemployment insurance, the child care, and all those measures that were going to households. What was left of that, which amounted to about $4 trillion in 2021 of government fiscal assistance and spending, mostly for households. And of course, some of that was freebies for businesses. Small and medium businesses got $1 trillion in grants as a result of that bill 2021. But they shifted all that early, and they gave it what was left and threw in some more, and they gave it to corporate America. That's the 1.7 trillion. And to get to your point, part of that 1.7 trillion were these big subsidies for corporations to invest in the U.S., and that's been sucking money capital, investment capital out of Europe to the U.S. and exacerbating on top of the sanctions, exacerbating the condition in Europe. And of course, it wasn't just sanctioning oil and gas. It raised the price of oil and gas 3-4 times what it was with Russian gas. And a lot of the basic industries, chemical industries and so forth, auto industries in Europe, particularly Germany, could not exist. And some of them are going out of business now. And that just makes Europe more dependent on the U.S. Well, you might ask, how the hell can they get away with this? Well, because since the creation of the European Union in the late 90s, which corresponds with the expansion of NATO, by the way, what happened was Europe created these supranational institutions across Europe, the European Commission, the European Council, European Central Bank, European Parliament, and these elites that are destroying Europe now are in those key strategic positions, and that kind of like a dual power revolution that's been going on in Europe. A revolution by the capitalists,
right?
By the workers.
The ruling elite revolution.
Yeah, there's food fight going on between different ranks of the capitalist elite as the empire begins to weaken here. And that's what all the MAGA and the Trumpists against the others, globalists, whatever you want to call them, is really about what kind of a strategy to keep the empire going. So what you see going on in Europe is this supranational institutions where these new elites who are totally aligned with the neocons and elites in the U.S. because that's where their future careers are.
Right.
Why are they destroying their own country? For their own personal career objectives. That's what it's really about. They're terrified if they go against the U.S. will find ways to get them dumped, and it will, and it can, right? But if they go along with it, well, careers and power and money, that all goes with, going along with the U.S. So it's these supranational institutions that are destroying Europe, really, and they are negating national sovereignty. And you see the resistance to that now beginning to bubble up in Europe in different places. In the spring, they're going to dump Schultz. Macron's in trouble, and one after another, these governments are beginning to fall in Europe. But it's going to take a while to do that, and Europe's going to blow up. I think the people are going to resist at some point here the loss of their national sovereignty. And I think in the next decade, you're going to see the European Union implode. Economically, it just can't continue.
Let me ask you something. Because as I said, for those of you who don't know, when Dr. Jack has been pretty spot on as far as his predictions, not pretty spot on, completely spot on. So I got to ask you this about you. Darn it, I ran my mouth so much I forgot my question, but it'll be back in a second at any rate, Dr. Jack. It was such a good one.
Let me elaborate a little bit.
It came back to me. It's important. This is important.
Okay.
This is important. Something I've been thinking. I want to ask you this. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple years under the Biden administration was all of the European elite, and they're like, we hate Trump. We're on board. We love you, Joe, and we hate Trump. We're going to try to get Kamala elected. We hate Trump. It has been my belief that the second Trump takes office, they'll all go, hey, good old buddy Donald, we said we hated you. That's water under the bridge. What can we do? Let's work together. We love you. That understanding the level of power that the emperor has, and that's what they kneel to, that they'll just go to the emperor's court and kneel like they would for. It wouldn't matter if you became president, if Trump or whoever, that they will do a 180 and they will come back and kiss the ring of Donald Trump. That is my belief, Dr. Jack. But what are yours?
Yeah, well, it's the same belief, right? I believe you're right. They'll kiss the ring and figure out how they can keep going. But, they got a real dilemma in front of them. Trump is going to threaten to pull out as he did before. That's part of his bargaining strategy, right?
Yeah.
but he's going to force the Europeans to really take over the Ukraine problem and also take over their own defense. And that's going to exacerbate the political situation in Europe longer term, because the Europeans have been able to enjoy this social safety net, which is pretty nice over there, and they're going to have to pay for their own defense, which means they're going to have to squeeze the social programs. And that's going to exacerbate the situation even further in Europe, I believe.
And you were about to elaborate.
Let's add one more dimension to this, and this is Greenland, right? Greenland, what's going on with Greenland?
Yeah.
It's not ridiculous. The WAPO and New York Times are saying, "Oh, this is ridiculous." No. This is part of a strategy, not just of Trump, but of U.S. elites, the section of U.S. elites. They will, I predict, they will take over Greenland as a U.S. territory. That will happen. And why has that happened? Is that so crazy? No. You got to look at it in terms of the bigger picture. And Panama is part of this too, right?
Okay.
This is all about denying China Arctic routes, shipping routes to Europe and the Atlantic. That's what this is all about. And Denmark will give up this in the New York Minute because the way it's going to be done, he won't have to negotiate with Denmark. The U.S. will do a little simple maneuver, political maneuver, and you'll see this new independence movement, which is already beginning in Greenland, right?
And protest.
Yeah, and they'll form an interim constitutional independence government, and then the U.S. will throw some bucks at them, and they will join the U.S. as a territory. Because Greenland, of course, the name is a misnomer. There's nothing green, but they do see green, and it's called the U.S. dollar, right? The Greenlanders will take the money and run, and Denmark will just run. Okay, so this is going to happen, but you got to understand it's part of this consolidation of the U.S. empire, circling the wagons in preparation for the conflict with China. Panama Canal is the same thing. The Panama Canal is having trouble here. It's not large enough, and the Panamanian government won't invest in it, and they have to expand the canal. Why? Because the biggest U.S. aircraft carriers can't get through it. They got to get through the canal to get to the Western Pacific. So they got to really expand that canal. The U.S. is tired of the Panamanian government dragging its heels on it. The U.S. wants to take over and do that expansion, because if not, then, the carriers got to go around South America, which is a long way and a long time, right? So Panama, all this talk by Trump about Panama is really the same as the talk about Greenland. It's about denying China access through the canal, because China has been doing, some interesting things economically with the canal. And the U.S. is getting worried about that, right? So this is really about preparing for a war with China in the 2030s.
Wow. Now, the one of the things that's happening now is they're shutting off gas coming out of Ukraine. Coming through Ukraine. Now, it appears to me part of this is that normal regime change operations. We make Hungary suffer. We make Slovakia suffer. We make Transnistria suffer. These areas that we want to suffer. We want to do a regime change. So we find a way to sanction your country, to bring pain to your country. Then we have some protests. What do you know? Protests are starting to rise in Slovakia, right? And then we do the usual and try to overthrow your government. So I think there is a political element to this, so that they can economically strangle these. They just can't out and out sanction them. They're members of the EU, they're members of the NATO, so they can't just come out and sanction them, but they can do something that effectively hurts them really bad, hopefully to destabilize the government. And as they always do, then we'll come in and take advantage of it and tell the people, we've got the guy just for you. His name is Pierre Macron, Obama, Starmer, Schultz. Just a guy for you, right? Your thoughts on the gas being shut off of Ukraine, both, I guess, from that political perspective, but also from the economic perspective?
Yeah, well, who shut off the gas? Zelensky shut off the gas. Zelensky said to Russia, we want more money for this gas, right? Or we're going to shut it off. We're going to block it. And Russia says, no, we got a contract with you. Believe it or not, this war is going on, but the Russian gas is going through these Ukrainian pipelines anyway. No one wants to touch the energy, right? Well, anyway, Zelensky precipitated this and said to Russia, we're going to shut it off if you don't give us more money. And the Russians said, no, we're not going to do that, right? And then he did, right? And Russia says, okay, no more gas. The Western media is saying, oh, Russia shut it off. No, Zelensky shut it off. And this is what I find very interesting. The day after Zelensky does this, all of a sudden, these big contracts with U.S. LNG natural gas are signed immediately signed. They knew exactly the timing of this. To negotiate an LNG deal, it takes months, maybe years. Right? They had this all set up, right? So that they just precipitated it. They have that geopolitical extra, frosting on the cake, put pressure on Hungary and Slovakia, and get them to play ball with NATO. And some of the people in Brussels want to just drive Hungary, Slovakia out of NATO. But if they can do it by forcing a regime change through economic instability because you don't have any gas, they're going to do that first too, and that's what's going on there. But it's really part of this whole sanctions approach. It's part of preventing Russian natural gas going through Ukraine to Europe and the revenues that come from that, which I think is less than 5% of Russia's natural gas revenue. So it's not going to have a big hit on Russia. And they'll find alternative ways, they'll maybe redivert the gas through the pipelines that exist through Turkey to Southern Europe, to Italy and the Balkans, and then maybe Italy will share some of that with Hungary and Slovakia. We don't know whether how that's going to work out yet, but that's not the only pipeline. There's also a pipeline that goes to Poland, so from Russia to Poland. So you got to understand it's part of the increasing desperation here and risk taking with regard to sanctions policies, and that's really what's kind of going on right now. And we'll continue to see increasing the pressure on the sanctions policy. In what ways? It may look like we got something emerging called gunboat sanctions, right? All of a sudden, some of the shadow fleet of Russia are beginning to sink in different places, in the Black Sea and in the Western Mediterranean and in the Baltics now. All this phony stuff about Russian ships destroying cables to Sweden and all that stuff. This is all false flag shit, right? So we'll see what happens, but they're trying to increase the pressure. Now, this may just be something that exists at the end of the Biden regime. We'll see whether it gets cut off once Trump comes into office here in a couple of weeks. But, I don't put it past the deep state that really runs the show in the U.S. Presidents think that they rule the country, but they don't. The last real president we had was JFK, and they shot him because he thought he could run the country. These presidents go along with the deep state, deep state being, CIA, NSA, FBI, Justice, that whole crew there that doesn't change. That's the state apparatus, that bureaucratic state apparatus that doesn't change. The governments come and go, governments are elected, they come and go, but the state remains and it doesn't change, and its policy doesn't change. This is the policy of the state. And we'll see what happens though with Trump, which I'm not as optimistic that things are going to change, especially quickly, just because Trump's in office here. With the negotiations will begin with the Ukraine. war, but I don't see a solution here in a matter of months. I think this thing is going to drag on.
Let me ask you this. I look at it all as part of the domination plan for the U.S. empire in Europe. And here's what I mean. They've said to the Europeans, okay, you can't buy anything from Russia, which means you can only buy it from us. And next they want to say you can't buy anything from China, which means you can only buy it from us. Even though we don't make the stuff that China makes, it doesn't matter. Here's the point. At some point, Europe's going to cry uncle. They said we can't go any further. We can't go into war with China. We can't do that because it'll absolutely wipe us out and we'll be effectively Haiti, right? Unless you take complete control of them. So I think part of this is take total and complete impoverish, completely and totally subjugate Europe, and then you can drag them into a war with China. Even though whatever's left of Europe, you just drag them into the war with China because they're not economically and politically stable enough to say no.
Yeah,
I think it's a highly flawed plan, but it sounds just about psychotic enough that it could be part of the neocon plan. Dr. Jack, sorry.
Yeah, well, it is part of the neocon plan, and you can see it in the U.S. pushing Europe to raise tariffs on Chinese imports, right? And that's going to destroy Europe. Europe was far more dependent on China trade than the U.S. You raise tariffs on China, China raises tariffs back on you. Tariffs is a two-way game, right? You can do tit for tat here. And that's going to hurt European companies, and particularly like auto companies, which were deeply involved in China, are being driven out now. And the whole idea of Trump saying 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, right? EVs, right? In the U.S. Well, he's got to force Europe to impose similar tariffs on EV imports into Europe from China, right? Because if they go into Europe, they just come back into the U.S. through Europe, right?
Right, exactly.
So it's part, as I said, you got to see we're in a period where the U.S. empire is circling the wagons and preparing for the long game here with China. It's being diverted with Russia in the Middle East, and that may be the strategic defeat of the empire because it's too preoccupied right now with other conflicts in the empire, and it can't really prepare sufficiently for its conflict with China right now. I mean, China loves what's going on because it's just buying it time, and militarily and economically, China is technologically, China is catching up for surpassing the U.S. in a number of areas. Right now, for example, AI, artificial intelligence, which is critical for next generation weaponry. Right, artificial intelligence. If you look at the patents signed for artificial intelligence, it's a two-country game. Over 90% of the patents are filed by the U.S. and China. Europe isn't even in the game. Yeah, I mean maybe 3-4% or something like that.
And Russia just said they're going to they just had a lot of articles I saw in Russian media where they said they've signed some kind of agreement with China so Russia and China can work together on AI. So it sounds to me like they are combining their military technological prowess, that they're building a unified technological front against U.S. imperial domination to some extent.
Yeah, and step by step, a unified military weaponry cooperation going on, and the junior partner in that will be Iran as well, I think.
Yes.
And then who knows about North Korea here? But clearly, as I've said many times, history will show that Biden has done more to destroy the U.S. empire than Xi and Putin combined, And
anything in history, anything 4 years. Yeah, he's destroyed Europe completely, and he's created a dynamic to me that is, as you said, circling the drain, can't be stopped right now. I mean, because the issue to me with the international finance, and as you know, is faith. if people believe that you have a strong economy, they'll invest in it. They'll buy your bonds, all those kinds of things. That the U.S. economy is only, quote, strong because people believe in it and believe that it has a future. And as that faith disappears over the last 4 years, that has evaporated. I don't see how you make it in the long run. Maybe that's why Trump wants to have a Bitcoin national reserve or something like that, because maybe certain very powerful factions are looking at the future saying, if we don't have some kind of techno cash, the actual dollar itself is going to disappear or something like that, Dr. Jack.
Yeah, well, I basically agree with you here. The empire is, at the beginning of a real challenge here, the U.S. empire. Part of that is, military, we've been talking about. Part of it is also financial and economic. The BRICS have left the station. The BRICS train has left the station. There's no way of calling it back. And one of my predictions in my most recent radio show, Alternative Visions, at the beginning of the year, I make predictions. And one of my economic predictions, is that the BRICS will add even more players here over the course of this year. I think there's like 20 now and even more. And they haven't developed an alternative currency yet. But just the fact that they are exchanging using their own currencies and avoiding the dollar means less demand for the dollar in the long run. And of course, if you have less demand for something as a transaction or reserve currency, both, well, then the price of the dollar falls, right? The value of the dollar will fall. Right now, it's rising for short-term reasons. But long-term, the dollar value is going to decline. And that's going to exacerbate the deficit and debt situation in the U.S. because the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the U.S., is how the deficits, which are now almost $2 trillion a year, are being financed. In other words, the U.S. Treasury and the Fed, on behalf of the Treasury, sells these bonds around the world, Treasury bonds. At least a third, 40% of them are bought by foreigners, right? But if the dollar is falling, foreign interests, both U.S. and actual foreign, are going to buy fewer treasuries. China's already, divesting itself of treasuries. It was like 1.1 trillion. Now it's like 800 billion. So slowly, steadily, China's getting rid of. That's why central banks are buying gold, because they're not buying treasuries anymore. And the point is, if your currency or anything is falling in value, you're not going to buy it. You see, before they buy treasuries, they have to buy dollars in order to buy treasuries. You cannot buy treasuries with Argentine pesos. You got to buy dollars. You got to convert your currency wherever you are around the world to dollars. You got to buy dollars in order to buy treasuries. But who wants to buy dollars if the value of it is falling? It might fall further. All right. So you're going to wait, right now, the value of the dollar is up. So, they're buying dollars. Their intermediate investment is safe before they buy treasuries. Right. But, when the Fed's got to roll over almost $2 trillion every year in order to cover the budget deficit gap, tax revenues, because of the massive tax cut, $17 trillion since 2001. We've cut taxes 80% on the rich and corporations, right? $17 trillion plus the slow growth of the economy, which impacts tax revenues, right? It gives you these deficits every year, which are now almost $2 trillion a year, right? Well, they're going to spend that money, that gap, that difference of $2 trillion, but where are they going to get the dollars to do it? They, meaning Congress, right? Well, the Fed, the Treasury, has to issue bonds to get this money from investors in order to fill the budget deficit gap, you see. And the money keeps flowing out of the U.S. That's part of the empire reason. The money flows out of the U.S. In investments and foreign aid and wars and, the 100 plus bases the U.S. has around the world. The money has been flowing out for decades, right? But it's been coming back part of the empire's arrangement was this money gets recycled back to the U.S. That's what I call the twin deficits institution. You run a trade deficit and the money flows out, but it gets called back to finance the budget deficit. And that has allowed in the last quarter century the U.S. to have these massive tax cuts and spend $8-9 trillion on these wars. But that system that's crucial to the empire's existence is beginning to break down. It hasn't totally broken down yet, but it's along with the dollar, the number one linchpin of the U.S. global economic empire. I'll be talking about this in more detail in my forthcoming book this year, The Twilight of American Imperialism, which looks at it economically, not just geopolitically of what's going on. But the twin deficit problem is going to persist and get worse here. We're running these huge deficits, and Trump is going to try to do something about it. I've been also talking about and predicting that we have this massive austerity social program cuts coming here in a few more months. Massive. That's why you got Musk and Swarmy and Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, right? And what that's about is these private billionaires are going to define the cuts and throw it over the transom to Congress, and like that, they're going to vote it up. The same process they used when they passed Trump's tax cuts in 2017, $4.5 trillion, right? You had these two capitalists there, Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn, who were from Goldman Sachs. In the back room, they structured this tax cut, $4.5 trillion, mostly for businesses and investors, right? And they threw it over the transom in December of 17. Congress didn't get to amend it or anything, just voted up or down, went through like that. Well, they're going to use the same process for pushing Trump's austerity programs here in a couple of months, which will also continue, and for permanent reasons, Trump's tax cuts of 2017. That's part of the renewal, right? Renewing his tax cuts here. And the Congressional Budget Office has estimated that that's going to cost another $4 trillion, a $4 trillion whack to the deficit and the national debt. National debt, just the cumulative deficits, right? $4 trillion. Well, how are they going to offset some of that? Well, that's where Doge comes in. That's where austerity comes in, right? They're going to go after social program spending. They're going to cut 100,000 federal workers out of Washington, D.C., and they're going to simply take a lot of this money. It's to some extent, it's going to be smoke and mirrors, right? They're going to say, okay, for example, no more education department. You've heard about that. They're going to end the education. Well, there'll be an education department, except they're going to throw it at the states and say, you fund it. We're not funding it anymore. And they're going to cut spending, federal spending that way. But the states are going to have to increase their spending and their deficits, right? To the extent that they want to do it. It won't be as much, and you're going to see other things similar to that going on with Doge here, right? But the point is Doge, Musk and Swarmy are the analog for Mnuchin and Cohn. The same thing is going to be happening here, but it's going to be renewing the tax cuts and corporate tax cuts, because it was $4.5 trillion. The media has been saying, and these dumb mainstream economists, like Robert Reich and Krugman and everything, they've been saying, well, the tax cuts, Trump tax cuts, were only $1.5 trillion. Nonsense. I did the calculations, and people got to understand that the whole argument of $1.5 trillion back in 2018 was predicated on the U.S. economy for the next 10 years growing at a whopping 3.5% GDP. Because if you grow, you bring in more tax revenue. Well, 2020, 21, right? What happened? Crash, right? It didn't go to 3.5%. And ever since then, it's been growing at a half to 2/3 of what's normal, barely 2%. Or actually less than that if you properly estimate inflation, which they don't do to cover up how weak the economy really is. Anyway, you see what I'm describing are connections here between the empire and its weakness and the domestic situation in the U.S. and the weakness of the U.S. economy and the deficits and so forth, right? It's connected. And as the empire weakens, the domestic economy is going to weaken as well. And as it weakens, the rich are going to take care of their income, and their Congress is going to ensure that, but at the expense of the rest of us more and more. That's what happens when empires implode, you see, and that's what's happening. We're at the early stages of this. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to, implode overnight. There's some leftist economists who are saying, "Oh, you got 6 months, you got 1 year." No, that's not the way it's going to happen. It's a long, drawn out process here. But that train has left the station.
Let me ask you about this. You create so many questions. I do want to get to Jimmy Carter, but before we do, one other question. I see this as connected. One of the things I've been watching a lot lately, looking at a lot lately, is the car market, right? And I look online, and here's what I hear from people, because like I've said, people that know me, I'm a country guy. I have a pickup truck, right? I have a car, but I got a pickup truck. Always like to have a pickup truck, right? The people that buy pickup trucks are middle class people. Mine's a 2013. It's an used pickup truck, but get the job done. People go to you see this everywhere. They go to them and they're like, my God, middle class people drive trucks, right? 80, 90, 100,000. The trucks are sitting on the lots. Nobody's buying them. We see Nissan and Honda or Toyota, whoever, merging. All of these cars now are 80, 50,000 for just a regular old car. So there's this car market that is totally detached from the reality of our economy. As people are working, more and more people are working up at the local mini mart for barely much over minimum wage. The car market is set for doctors and lawyers. And those two things aren't going to match up very, very well. What's up with that? And how, I just can't see how these car companies can stay in business when I imagine they must or have to, whatever, when the numbers on their product, they might as well put them, if you're going to say 100,000 for a pickup truck, you might as well call it 100 million, because ain't nobody buying it. Your thoughts on that? What's happening there and how that represents what's happening in our economy? Because there's something dramatically wrong. Go ahead.
Yeah, they're at the end of that game, pretty much, as you're describing it. How have they gotten people to continue to buy cars or trucks here as they kept raising their prices? How have they done? Debt, credit, right? That's how they do it. They get people to buy on credit. It's not the actual cost immediately. It's the credit. You get it, and you struggle with the payments thereafter. Look at auto debt. Auto debt is well over $1 trillion now. It really shot up in the last decade. Well, that's because they're extending more and more credit. Well, how can they do that? Well, if the average person who buys an auto or a car or something looks at the monthly payment, right?
Right.
You can get people to buy a $60,000 car if you extend the term of the payment, right? Instead of, people used to buy a car 3 years or less.
Yes.
Right? 3 years. Now it's 6, 8, 10 years to buy a car. You're paying for 10 years, over the time, and people need the car, or sometimes, buy when they shouldn't buy. And they just look, well, what's the monthly payment? Well, okay, I got to pay 10 years. Well, I'll worry about that later. I can make that monthly payment. That's the game they've been able to play. But there are limits to how far they can go with that. And I think, as you point out, they're beginning to reach the limits. So we'll see what happens with the car market. But and part of the problem with the car market is that the EV section of the market has really hit a wall. People aren't buying plug-ins anymore as much as they used to. maybe hybrids, but they're going back to gasoline here, because
Yeah.
it's really no deal, especially now that with Trump in office, he's going to end that EV credit. That's gone. That's part of.
And we never built the infrastructure. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I've known people that have gone to China and they're like, everywhere you can plug in, you know what I mean? The infrastructure, they've got millions and millions of places. You're right. Everywhere you look in China, you can plug in. Here, you driving down, good luck finding a place to plug it. I know people who are unhappy with electric cars, and that's one of the big complaints. Hey, you got to have to plug it at home. But if I want to drive, to Myrtle Beach to go to the beach,
Yeah,
it takes me forever because I got to drive all out of the way to find it, especially when I get in North to South Carolina. Where the hell are you going to find a place to plug in your car there?
Yeah. Well, most of the purchase of the EVs thus far were upper middle class people, right?
Right.
Not just because of the cost. I mean, Tesla has been price gouging the hell out of people for some time. Grabbing that $7,000 what is government credit, it's just a subsidy to the damn auto companies, to Tesla. That's all it is, because they just raise their price and grab that. I mean, it's like college education, right? You get these loans, and the colleges just jack up their tuition and fees and pay their presidents like they were CEOs, right? And add this big administrative bureaucracy that sucks up all the education loans. It's the same thing. When you come to autos, I think we're at $1.5 trillion auto debt. And what's happening, supporting your estimate, is that the lower end buyers, lower income buyers, who are buying cars on credit are beginning to default. We're beginning to see a lot of default. I think the default rate's like 7%, which is like double what it should be at the low end of the autos. People are going to just start turning back the keys, as they did, during the 2008, 9, and 2021. The auto companies are in deep doo-doo, especially the German European auto companies, because they're getting a double whammy here from the U.S., right? The same process is going on economically internally in Europe, but the U.S. is then exacerbating it with its various measures.
Let's talk about Jimmy Carter. Like so many people, it's weird with Jimmy Carter because he was demonized, he's been lionized, he's been, all of the above. Some people on the left have lionized him. He was supposedly the worst president ever. But then there are other people, so many people. Now, that being said, he's taken some good positions. I'm not going to say he hasn't taken some good positions on some things, but he's a hero or a villain. What is he, Dr. Jack? What do we need to know about?
Well, what he is was a terrible president, but they're ignoring that. The whole thing about Jimmy Carter, all this puff pieces coming out in the mainstream media and everything about Jimmy Carter. The U.S. tries to lionize its presidents and cherry pick the things they did and ignore the terrible things that they did, and make them into kind of like beatified saints, right? They're not even saints, but they're beatified, right?
Right.
Which is a pre-state to be in the state, right? A saint. But the media is doing the puff pieces on Jimmy Carter. I mean, yeah, he built a lot of houses. So what? I mean, you think of Jimmy Carter, you think, what did he do as president? Well, I'm writing a piece, on Jimmy Carter's legacy here, coming out in a day or so, and look, he lit the fuse. He lit the fuse on all the Middle East wars. Yeah, it goes back to Jimmy Carter, and Afghanistan war. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean this, right? Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, who was a real Russia hater, part of that whole white Russian or white Polish immigrant crowd that came to the United States after World War II. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is, who was the number one neocon for decades, right? Was Carter's national security advisor in 79. And he came to Carter in the summer of 79 and he said, look, You know, there's this revolution in Afghanistan. This general, Najibullah, took over, and they have this secular government, by the way, at the time. And we got to destabilize that government. And if we destabilize it, this is, Brzezinski talking to Jimmy Carter in the summer of '79. How do I know this? Because it's in his autobiography. That's how I know this, right? And he's talking to Jimmy Carter. And he says, let's destabilize Afghanistan, arm the Mujahideen, and those were the peasant rebels, right?
Bin Laden's people.
And lure the Soviet Union into Afghanistan, and then we'll bleed it dry by this proxy war that we will finance and fund, right? And sure enough, after 6 months of this, in early 1980, Najibullah, the president, elected president by the time, calls in the Soviet Union. And then we know that whole story in the 1980s, don't we? Well, that spawned Al-Qaeda eventually.
Good point.
And then, of course, we have that whole history. So he lit that fuse. And then on top of that, looking at another place, Iran, Jimmy Carter, tries to invade Iran. Iran grabbed the hostages, and he sends this task force of American aircraft. He thinks he's going to somehow grab those hostages in Tehran, right? I mean, these planes fly from the sea hundreds of miles over Iran, and they're supposed to somehow land in Tehran and grab those 300 plus hostages and take them away. Well, like an Entebbe raid, the Israelis raided Uganda, Entebbe raid. And, Iran was not Uganda, right? And they got shot down. What a stupid adventure. And that's part of his legacy as well. Another part of his legacy is Camp David, right? Camp David Accords, where he brings together Israel and Egypt, right? And he gets a peace deal out of them in '78. How does he get it? He buys them off, right? What does that mean? He pays them money, He pays $5 billion a year to Israel and a couple billion a year to Egypt, right? How much money have we given Israel since its formation? $320 billion. We've given Israel $320 billion, and we just signed a deal where we're going to give them $3.8 billion a year more, not counting extra bombs, of course, until 2028. We've been throwing money at Israel, billions of dollars every year, and I think, at Egypt as well since 1978. I think Egypt is about $100 billion we've thrown at Egypt. And we've thrown, in addition to that, as I said, maybe $175 billion or more to Israel since 1978. He bought them off, right? Has it worked? You got peace in the Middle East? No, you don't have peace. It's the worst it's ever been in the Middle East. But that's part of his heritage, his legacy as well. And then domestically, what do you got? Well, neoliberalism begins with Jimmy Carter, not with Ronald Reagan. He's the one who introduced some measures, tax measures and fiscal measures, almost doubles defense spending and whatever, that in 78, 79, Carter makes this turn towards corporate America. We have the formation of the Business Council and Business Roundtable then, as the capitalists in the U.S. said, we got to take, in the 70s, the crisis, we got to take more control of these parties and the policies. And the Business Council was formed, 50 of the largest U.S. corporations, and they put this whole neoliberal template together in the late 70s. And Jimmy Carter starts implementing it. And then Ronald Reagan, blows open the door and really develops neoliberalism. And off we go for the last half century almost with neoliberal policies. Right? It begins with Reagan, but it really begins with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was
going after unions.
Deregulate industry, in the 1980s. He deregulated industries right and left. He intervened in the labor negotiations in the Chrysler strike,
I
right?
forgot.
He,
Yep.
and he imposed concession bargaining on the auto workers union, and of course we knew that became the practice for decades after, and it's only now just beginning to end, perhaps, with the recent Teamsters agreement and to some extent the auto workers agreement and the longshore agreements and so forth, right? So 40 years of concession bargaining and the collapse of unions and offshoring, and we lose 10 million perhaps manufacturing jobs to offshoring, which is part of neoliberalism as well. But it begins, these domestic policies begin with Jimmy Carter. That's part of his legacy as well, right? The inflation, chronic inflation, begins with Jimmy Carter. The supply side inflation in the 1979.
Was that partially brought about by the Vietnam War, in your opinion?
Which was
The
brought up?
the stagflation and all of that stuff in the certainly we had the Vietnam War, we had the whole issue with the energy crunch and all of that in the 70s, but I've heard a lot of people say that this massive spending and on the Vietnam War was a big part of why we left the gold standard, why all the changes that were made in the stagflation.
Well, you can't lay the cause to the war specifically here. It's part of a bigger process. Yes, in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard, or the dollar gold standard, and the result was just to let the central banks manage the whole float. It's called the managed float system. In 74, the U.S. agrees with the Saudis about this. You can have the production of the oil, Aramco, American Arab, but you got to recycle the money back. And that everybody agrees in 74 that all the energy is going to be bought with dollars. You see, that begins in 74. And of course, that's the basis of U.S. control here with global control with everyone's got to buy dollars here to trade. And then, of course, later in the decade, we got the problem with inflation, but it was supply side inflation, not so much demand. Demand added some inflation in the late 60s and early 70s. That's true. But the deep recession of 70, 73, 74 knocked out the demand side of inflation. Inflation is because of demand and supply, right? It knocked it out. What happened with inflation under Carter was supply side. What happened was, you had the problem with energy and oil with the result of the Iran hostages and so forth, that crisis, right? The earlier crisis was because of the maneuvering by the Middle Eastern Saudis and so forth to use the war there with, in the 73 war and the weakness of Nixon, who was about to get impeached and resign, to use that to force up energy, oil prices. So, the inflation in 72, 73 was partly demand because of the war, government spending, but it was also supply side. Well, when you get to the war, you get to the late 70s, it wasn't war, it was almost all supply side. It was almost all energy. And you got to understand, it's not just the price of crude oil that drives this, but because the price of crude rises because of these geopolitical situations, supply, in other words, the big oil companies just tack on, they mark it up. They don't care if the Saudis raise prices. They just mark up the price after that, right, of oil. And then, of course, they own the big oil tankers, and they mark that up. And they own the refineries in the U.S., and they refine it, and they mark that up. And they own the gas stations, so they get several. The big energy companies, don't mind the fact they kind of like it when the crude price rises, because they just gouge the hell all the way up the chain and make a lot of money as a result. That's what happened with the late 70s. It was mostly supply side inflation. But you got to understand neoliberal policy under Reagan was to deal with foreign supply side causes of inflation in 80, 81, to deal with it by taking it out on the backs of consumers and workers, right? You raise interest rates to 18%, it shuts down the construction industry and the auto and manufacturing. And then it really, debilitates demand. So demand wasn't the cause, but demand was the solution. That's neoliberalism, and we're facing the same thing right now, right? We have the supply chain problems that grew out of the COVID era here, right? And the price gouging by corporations, which is a habit now, that went on. And how are they going to control inflation? Well, they're going to create austerity and lay people off, and then people are going to buy less. That's the way the capitalist system works. They make money, and then they by creating the problem, they create a problem by making money, and then they make money off of the crisis and the solutions to the problem. They make it both ways, you see, and that's what we're facing again.
And I think what that generates is what we're seeing in the car market. At some point, the game runs out. At some point, it gets to the point where the numbers don't work, because any country, to some extent, I'll end by saying this: you have to deliver for the people to keep political stability. At some point, the one thing that the neocons, I won't say they don't talk about, they create the opposite. What do countries want? One word. What do people want? One word: stability. And in order to maintain that stability, you have to have a healthy balance between the problems that you have and who pays for them. And since all the problems are generated by giving more to the rich and the corporations, and all the solutions are generated by taking more from the poor, at some point you got $100,000 pickup truck sitting on the lot, and nobody has money to buy it, and you end up with what we have now. And I think that's a metaphor for our entire economy at this point. You get the last word, Dr. Jack.
Yeah. Well, part of neoliberalism is wage compression. And that's been going on since the early 1980s. Real wages, adjusted for inflation, are lower today. And this is government statistics, are lower today than they were in 1982. The real wage is lower than in 1982. And the whole thing is to keep it lower. Well, how did they keep it lower? Well, they destroy unions, first of all, in the private sector. I think only, 5% of the private sector is unionized now today, right? They terrorize workers by sending their jobs offshore, so they're worried about holding on to their jobs, right? They create right-to-work states expansion. They don't raise the minimum wage. All this is keeping wages down. Why aren't people revolting? Well, they make up the difference in the lack of wage growth by giving you credit.
Yes.
That's how people have continued by cheap credit. And to some extent by giving you cheaper imports from abroad. Walmart, most of the goods in Walmart are produced in China and Asia, right? So they give you cheap goods. You go to Walmart and they give you lots of credit. You buy $100,000 trucks, right, on credit, and that's how they've kept the system going without people. It's like, ancient Rome, you give them circuses and bread and, pacify them. But there are limits to that, of course. And even the Roman Empire collapsed, right? As we know. Why? Because it had a fiscal crisis, right? Its empire got chipped away. In come the Franks and the Vandals and the Visigoths, and they chip away the best areas of surplus producing parts of the empire, and the East goes another way. And they didn't have enough money to fund their armies anymore, and their armies became skeleton, and then all the barbarians crossed, right? Well, the same thing's going on here. When we run out of the money, Yeah, the central bank can create money, but there are limits to that too. Uh, when we run out of the empire providing surplus and wealth, and we run out of credit, right? Then things begin to fall apart, right? And we're on that track. We're on that track in the U.S. and the empire shrinks, which brings us back to what we started talking about, and that is the elites in the U.S. kind of know this. The smart ones, they're not all dumb neocons. They understand this, and they're circling the wagons. They're consolidating the core of the empire, right, which is G7, right, G8 if you include Australia and New Zealand, and the core within the core is what they call the Five Eyes, right, the Anglo-American sector. They're consolidating that now and trying to I mean, that's what Greenland and Panama Canal are all about. That's what the European policies are all about, right? Japan does whatever the U.S. wants it to.
South Korea also, yeah.
Since 1945, they're consolidating and preparing. But then they got these problems on the periphery that they can't resolve. They can't resolve this Ukraine NATO thing, although, they're probably close to that. But boy, they're not going to be able to resolve the Middle East thing because, you got Israel that has control of the U.S. government and is going to get whatever it wants from the U.S. government, including probably a war with Iran. War meaning an aerial attack on Iran. There's no way they could conquer Iran and occupy Iran, right? And so that's coming, I think Trump's going to do an LBJ, right? What do I mean by that? LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, right? President in the early 60s, when Kennedy got killed in 63, right? The intensity of the demands from the deep state, from the CIA and the military, particularly Air Force, wanting to invade Cuba again after a deal was made, with the Soviets not to invade. After Kennedy died, the pressure on LBJ was growing to reinvade Cuba. The militaristic side of the empire wanted that invasion. Well, what did LBJ do? He couldn't violate the agreement with the Soviets without opening up that whole problem again, right? So what did he do? I think he threw him the bone to Vietnam. That's what he did to divert all that pressure, militarist pressure to invade Ukraine. He said, well, let's go after Vietnam. I'll give you a bone right here. He thought that would be over quickly, but of course he was wrong. Well, I see the possibility of Trump throwing the military that wants to continue the fight in Ukraine, throwing them the bone of, let's not fight Russia. They fight back, right? Let's go after a smaller game, which is Iran, right? And then you've got the factor of Netanyahu and the Zionists, controlling the U.S. government. They've said, Netanyahu has bragged publicly, I own the U.S. Congress. He's right. He owns them, right? He can get whatever he wants out of them. And whoever runs for office in the U.S. has to kiss the Israeli ring, right? And that's right up there with the presidential candidates and Musk. Musk made a point, a little bit critical of Israel, about a year or so ago. And boy, they came after him. And it looks like they were going to take over his companies, right? So what did he do? He made the trek to Israel and he kissed Netanyahu's ring, So even the big capitalists in the U.S. have to toe that line. And of course, it doesn't matter who the politician was, Biden, you kiss the Israeli ring, the Zionist ring, right? And Trump, the same thing, RFK Jr., the same thing. You can't run for office in the U.S. unless you're pro-Israel. Not even pro-Israel, because Zionism is going to destroy Israel, right?
An irrational Zionist.
You're pro-Zionist. You're pro-Zionist, which is, what is Zionism? It's not Judaism. Zionism is an Eastern European proto-fascist colonial settler political ideology that's got its claws into Judaism, right? Because of the desire for a homeland, right? It's got its claws into Judaism, and it believes that, from the rivers to the sea, right? Except they don't mean the Jordan River; they mean the Nile and Euphrates River, right?
Yeah,
Fascism
right.
always is warlike and expands. It's got to expand. That's the nature of fascism. It goes to war and expands, right? So it's a proto-fascist political ideology, is what Zionism is. And to get back to my point, it's got its claws into the U.S. government as well. So I think we're going to see an LBJ-like thing where, okay, they downgrade the war in Ukraine here, and they end up with some kind of disturbance. And I think possibly a deal will be made in Ukraine because I recall the interview of Putin with Tucker Carlson. You remember that interview?
Mm-hmm,
And I think the most interesting thing, I watched it in detail, and the most interesting thing was Putin said, Western Ukraine, far west Ukraine, right, Lvov and that whole area, he says, Stalin gave that to Ukraine. That was not Ukraine. That was Poland and Romania and so forth. He gave it to him. And then Putin said, that's not part of the Slavic homeland, this idea of Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, right? That's not part of that. He said, if they want it, who cares? They're crazy if they want it, but if they want it, I don't care. And I think that planted the seed, right? I think you're going to see a solution eventually here where Putin's going to let the Western Ukraine go to the Europeans, right? And that's where the French and the others are talking about, coming in. NATO will come into Ukraine, the far west Ukraine along the border, but only when the deal is made, you see. They're not going to come in before. And I think that's what some kind of settlement will be if NATO is stupid, right? That's all it's going to get if it doesn't really come to terms here. And I don't see it really coming to terms with Russia. I think this war ends in Ukraine when the Ukrainian army collapses. I don't think there'll be a real negotiated truce here. Because, negotiated truce requires some trust on the parties in any kind of a negotiation that you're going to fulfill, the obligations you've agreed to. And after Minsk and Istanbul, I don't think the Russians are going to trust NATO and the West at all here, short of, their basic goals of this thing. So I think the war in Ukraine is going to eventually end, not this year, not 25, right? But I think the buy-off for the neocons, and the neocons are deeply involved in the Trump administration. They got their claws already well in there. You've got Waltz, you got Gorka, you've got Newland back in the State Department, you've got Rubio, who does whatever, the Adelson family tells him to do. You're going to see a trade-off. You got to buy them off. The U.S. has to buy them off. It's kind of like Greenland. Trump isn't going to negotiate with Denmark. He's going to negotiate with the U.S. capitalists to convince them that it's worth taking over the territory of Greenland. That's the negotiation, not with Denmark. Denmark is going to take the money and run. What are they going to do? Resist the U.S.?
Right.
Especially when you have a liberation or independence movement and a constituent assembly or whatever created which is the first step going on now in Greenland, right, to bring it in as a territory. So that's the negotiations that's going on behind the scenes, I think. The U.S. elite is not totally convinced, that it should absorb Greenland as a territory. But this strategic argument now against China, the real anti-China people in the U.S. Deep state are in agreement with, okay, we got to take over Greenland, we got to retake over Panama Canal, right? But we'll see what happens. But these are all the maneuvers And I think we're going to see a trade-off of Ukraine for Iran.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think you're right because I think the Russians know it. Because my understanding is like September 17th or something, the Russians are supposed to sign some massive military alliance with Iran, meaning they know it just as well as we know it. I also think that in the same way that the move by Europe to consolidate their power in Russia will be somewhat, I don't know if mitigated is the right word, interrupted by the reality that Europe does not provide for its people. And they're going to be in a revolutionary, they're going to be shaking their fists trying to tear that place apart, which is going to cause problems for the ruling elite. Eventually, not that far off, I think unrest and instability is coming to the US. I do believe this. I'm not saying this. I think that part of the job that the Trump administration is doing is to mitigate the internal unrest. That the people are screaming, we're upset about the censorship, we're upset about this or that. And the part of the Trump job is to come in and say, don't worry, guys, you have been treated bad. You've been, there's a lot of unrest and people are really unhappy. That part of their job in their so-called war on the deep state, which I believe when I see, is not a true war on the deep state, but to mitigate the unrest and anger amongst people so they can kind of get them back under control a bit. And then they can continue on with their nefarious and diabolical intentions worldwide. So.
Yeah, well, that's kind of what I think too, and that's the basis of my argument as I described it here about the austerity and so forth. They will throw some crumbs at people. They'll take things away because they got to cut that deficit and debt, and they will throw some crumbs at the people. No taxes on tips or something like that, right? So, we're going to see part of that. Going back to the original discussion on the natural gas, we left one thing out. Natural gas in Europe, we left one thing out. Yeah, there's a geopolitical, punish hungry element to it. Yes, there's a buy U.S. natural gas from U.S. companies. That's why we're cutting it off element to it. But there's also the element of how is Zelensky going to pay for the purchase of U.S. natural gas? Right? I'll tell you how he's going to. Already it's happening, right? Already by Zelensky saying to Russia, give us more money for the natural gas or we'll shut it down. Russia's saying no. Zelensky has already filed in European courts a case in which, Russia balked, violated the agreement. What are the penalties against Russia? He's going to get the European court to levy financial penalties against Russia. Well, and then the courts are going to allow him, Zelensky, to get payment for those penalties by, guess what? Taking part of the 260 billion frozen Russian assets in Western Europe. That's how they're going to pay for it. That's
how it goes straight to the U.S.
Going after that frozen assets. That's how they're going to pay for the damages for, quote, Russia cutting off their oil, right? They're going to pay for it by grabbing. That's the excuse, because they have no other way, Europe, to fund Ukraine. The U.S. is pulling out its money under Trump. Europe has got the basket, right? Is going to have to deal with it. Where's Europe going to get the money? They can't raise bonds themselves because the European Union has no fiscal union. They can't raise bonds. They've tried to raise a private bond, 54 billion. It failed. They can't do it. The only place they're going to get the money is to steal that money from Russian frozen assets. The court and this gas thing is the process, I believe, from which they're going to do it. Right. So that's another dimension, not just the geopolitical and the U.S. Oil and energy companies, providing and making money off of Ukraine, but also going after it's 260 billion in Brussels and European banks of Russian assets. They're going to go after that to pay. And that's how they're going to fund Ukraine. That's how Europe's going to continue to fund Ukraine, I think.
Yeah, to give them a little bit, buy more time. I think you're right. I think that at some point Trump says, hey, Ukraine, take this deal or blah, blah, or, so he can say to his MAGA people, I did everything. I got a deal. Russians, would you take that? Sure. The Russians say, yeah, I'll take it. Ukraine, would you take it? Ukraine says, no, we won't take it. And Europe says, that's okay. We got them covered.
But he's got a bargain with the neocons and the deep state in the U.S. You see,
right? Yeah, that's it. But it's all set up, because at that point it's all set, and they just say, well, Europe's going to handle it then, because they got $260 billion of Russian money that they've been dying to fill. I mean, as long as that's money been sitting there, the neocons have been looking at it saying, how can we get it? How can we get it? How can we get it? And as soon as the U.S. gets out of the way, they'll just take it. They'll just say, okay, well, the Russians has been how much they did wrong, judge. We're asking for $260 billion, and the judge will say, I grant you. We find the Russians $260 billion, and there we go. Carry on.
Yeah, and once they grab it, watch the euro collapse.
Oh, really? And why will the euro collapse when they grab it?
Because the Saudis and the other Middle Easterners have said, you grab that money, we're going to take our money out of Europe.
Who wouldn't?
Okay?
Who wouldn't?
Because it becomes clear that, Europe, you're going to grab other countries' money. Right now it hasn't really come to decision time, because they haven't really touched that. They've been skimming off the interest of that $260 billion, but they haven't really touched the principal. But bin Salman, the MBS, the guy who runs Saudi Arabia, has warned the French that if if Europe takes that money, it's just an indication you could take ours too, and we're going to start taking our money out. Well, when you take your money out, you're going to sell euros, right? And that means the demand for euros is going to decline, and the value of the euro is going to decline, right?
And the neocons are happier. Why? Because Europe has gotten weaker, and Europe is just a basket case, and it can't even survive. Europe's got their hand out for bread and crumbs from the U.S., which the U.S. is thrilled. The weaker Europe is, the more you can sink your grip is on them. So actually, the U.S. will be thrilled to. It makes sense. The U.S. will be actually, the neocons are probably saying to the Europeans, don't listen to anybody. You guys grab that money. You take that money. And once they take the money, boom, the euro collapses. Europe falls into disarray, and the U.S. says, "Don't worry, guys, we got you covered.
Which brings us back to my initial statement in this interview about the article I wrote in January 2022, right, where the objective was not just to destabilize Russia, but to make Europe economically dependent on the U.S. and for the U.S. to regain hegemony and control of NATO, which was weakening. The U.S. has allied with these small Eastern European states, and it runs NATO now. I mean, Germany and France, and England, they're not the drivers of NATO anymore. The U.S. has the votes in NATO. So, the whole war has enabled the U.S. to consolidate its political and economic dominance and control of Europe. That's the big gain here for U.S. imperialists, right? It's not so much, Russia. it's really about Europe, making Europe dependent on the U.S., because Europe is far more important than the Ukraine, right?
Yes,
and
it is.
We see what's happened, and it's part of consolidating the empire.
Wow. Well, Dr. Jack Rasmus, certainly thank you very much. Where can people find? Well, first of all, you see his name's Jack Rasmus. You can go to jackrasmus.com. In fact, I'm going to show everybody before we go so they can see it. ACK, jackrasmus.com. Everybody take a look at Dr. Jack's site. Give me a second here. There we go. We're going to share the screen.
That's my blog, jackrasmus.com. But you can also follow me on my radio show on Fridays on the Progressive Radio Network out of New York. I have a show on Fridays called Alternative Visions, where I, just talk about the events of the day, economic and political. Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, Alternative Visions. And, things that happen on a daily basis. You can follow me on X at Dr. Jack Rasmus. which is my handle there on X at DrJackrasmus. So that's my longer articles and so forth, written articles, are on the website jackrasmus.com. My radio show talks about the events of the previous week, and my X posts talk about events of the day. So both of those you can follow me.
All right. Well, thanks very, very much, Dr. Jack, and hopefully get you back next week, and we'll, it's interesting. Couple of things going on. The neocons said to the Venezuelans, "We're going to send, their latest iteration of Juan Guaido. He's got to go back on the 10th so that he can become the real president of Venezuela." They threatened Maduro, saying, "You better step down by the 10th, or things are going to happen." So God only knows what these lunatics are going to do between now and the 20th, and their attempt to set up whatever the hell they want to set up for the Trump administration.
Yeah, they want to create as much of a mess as they can, and in many places as they can before they leave, and hopefully some of the the shit they throw up against the wall will stick, and Trump will have to come and try to clean it off.
Well, I'll add one last thing, because I know we got to go. One last thing. That's part of what's going on with this gas and stuff in Europe. They know good and damn well that they're going to drive up the cost of energy worldwide. And they know good and darn well that's going to increase inflation here and weaken the Trump administration. Part of it is, but when I say you drive up inflation, it's going to hurt the American people, the working class. The Biden administration is taking actions deliberately to drive up inflation, to hurt the working class. Why? Because they know it'll hurt Trump's ability to address inflation. Not that he would or wouldn't, but they're setting the table, and they're clobbering us to set the table, Dr. Jack.
Yeah, well, inflation came down somewhat here, although it's underestimated by the government in 22, 23, early 24. But you're not going to get any more reduction in inflation. That's over, right? It's been creeping back up the last couple months. It's going to creep up even more here in 2025. The Fed is not going to cut rates anymore, I predict. It's through cutting rates, unless Trump browbeats Powell, the chair, even more like he did in 2017. We'll see. But interest rates aren't coming down. They may creep up after a while. Inflation is going to creep up here. We're going to have much more unemployment, particularly of public workers, federal public workers. And the outlook for the average worker consumer is not all that good, right? Because they're going to do what Obama did, just to make a comparison. In 2009, Obama's bailout bill was $787 billion, a third of which were tax cuts, right? And what did Obama do? That created deficits, and the recession created deficits. What did Obama do? Well, in 2011, he agreed to cut social spending by $1 trillion. So he gave $787 billion, and he took $1 trillion back, right, to try to deal with the deficits. Well, what did we do in 2020 and 21? Well, we gave $4 trillion of stimulus, half of which went just to companies, right? So about $2 trillion for the people. And we saw taking back some of that, in 2022 in those bills that we talked about. But now they're going to do the same thing. They're going to take back from the people by austerity cuts what they gave, because that's what they always do. In a crisis, they'll throw some money to stabilize people, as you say. And then when, the crisis is over, they'll take the money back. That's exactly what they're about to do. We're going to see a deja vu here of 2011 and 2025. But that's how neoliberal capitalism works.
And that's why your book is The Scourge of Neoliberalism. Dr. Jack
And the next one is The Twilight of American Imperialism.
And when's your book? When do you think that book will be out?
Late summer.
Okay, sounds good. We will talk plenty between then and now. Talk to you soon. Hopefully next week we can get together again.
yeah, let's see what happens once we have the swearing in on January 20. We're already seeing the outlines of austerity. We'll have more the week after January 20. By the end of the month, we'll have a clearer picture of what Swarmy and Musk are going to produce. I can't pronounce his last name. I just call him Swarmy.
It's good enough.
Right. And what they're going to throw over the transom for Congress to vote up or down.
Yep. All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. Don't forget, if you can afford it, donate to the show, and we have a join button. So click join and become a member of the of this particular channel. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're out.